Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we embark on a journey into darker times, an era of pestilence, hardship, and simple meals. We're exploring the true nature of existence during the Middle Ages. Discard the romanticized castles and fictional chivalry Hollywood sold you. In reality, survival for a single day might elude you. Let's now embark on this historical voyage. Congratulations, you've just roused yourself in the year 1325. The positive news, you're alive. The grim reality, so are the fleas. Your bed is a decaying straw mattress, infested with bugs and hay that smells precisely like a barn floor because, well, it was a barn floor 3 months prior. There's no luxurious memory foam, no soft pillows, and certainly no fine Egyptian cotton sheets. Just a coarse wool blanket that hasn't been laundered since last winter, now weighing roughly as much as a small cow from accumulated grime. You blink awake as the distant church bell resonates. It's the medieval equivalent of an alarm clock, only louder and somehow even less merciful. Your home is a humble wooden hut with a single room, devoid of windows, featuring an unappealing communal layout where your family, livestock, and domestic insects all share the same cramped space. The smell? Oh, it's a fragrant symphony, a subtle blend of stale beer, human sweat, goat, and something you desperately pray isn't mold, but deep in your soul, it probably is. Scented candles haven't been conceived, and even if they had, they'd simply melt onto your dirt floor. You attempt to stretch, but immediately regret it because the air is frigid and your joints ache. You are 22 years old, which, in medieval terms, places you roughly in middle age. Your spine creaks like an ancient wooden door, and your knees sound like a bag of rocks being vigorously shaken by a bewildered peasant. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor is either wet from last night's rain, which seeped through the thatched roof, or crusty from something your neighbor's chicken left behind. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the dwelling's ecosystem. Oh, and privacy? What's that? Your entire family, perhaps even a lingering cousin who never departed, are waking up beside you. There's no private chamber, no curtains, no personal time, just communal living. Welcome to morning in medieval Europe, where you are never truly alone because parasites, rodents, and 8 other people are always your constant companions. And this is just how your day begins. It only grows more challenging from here. So you've managed to crawl out of your loathsome pallet. Well done. Now, nature demands relief, and it's not asking politely, it's screaming. This is the moment you begin pining for a modern bathroom. There's no toilet, no seat, no toilet paper, no flush, not even a mildly resentful plunger in the corner. In the 14th century, relieving yourself is an adventure, a social experiment, and frequently a minor public event. If you're a peasant, your privy is likely a wooden bucket behind the dwelling, already full because Uncle Wolfram had a rough night after eating questionable turnips. The stench is overpowering. You hold your breath, attend to your business, and then, here's the kicker, you toss it into the street. Yes, the street. You're supposed to shout something like "Gare de Lou" before emptying it out the window. That's Old French for "watch out below." Though, frankly, no one ever moves swiftly enough. Streets in medieval towns are open sewers, a charming flowing stream of human waste, animal droppings, and mystery liquids you'd rather not inspect. If you're fortunate enough to reside in a town with public latrines, congratulations. You get to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in an outhouse where privacy is a myth and ventilation is a cruel joke. You might engage in small talk, but try not to breathe too deeply. Toilet paper? Never heard of it. Most people wipe with straw, leaves, rags, moss, or, if feeling particularly indulgent, a scrap of wool. Sometimes, nothing at all, which might explain why handshakes weren't popular yet. And if you're in a castle, surely it's better, right? Well, somewhat. You might have a garderobe, a hole in the wall that deposits your waste directly into the moat. A brilliant concept, except your enemies know this, and attackers occasionally climbed in through the waste chute. Talk about entering via the back door. So, whether you're a farmer or a baron, Medieval toileting is a humiliation ritual. It's cold, it's public, it's dangerous, and it's never not disgusting. One misstep on a wet stone path, and you're face first in humanity's leavings. And you still haven't brushed your teeth, but we'll address that next. You've navigated the toilet. You deserve a reward, perhaps a pleasant breakfast? Something warm, delectable, comforting? Sadly, this is medieval Europe. Comfort is a rare commodity. Breakfast, if one can call it that, is a somber ritual. There are no eggs Benedict, no coffee machines sputtering to life, and certainly no avocado toast. You sit or squat by the fire, facing a wooden bowl containing something that appears scraped from mire-stained footwear. Welcome to your daily portion of pottage. Pottage is a thick, viscous concoction brewed for whatever ingredients are available. Grains, root vegetables, perhaps a few beans if luck favors you. It's been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks, with new additions merely dumped to top the old. It's less a recipe and more a perpetual culinary gamble. Beside it, a hunk of bread so hard it could deflect arrows. It's crafted from coarse rye or barley flour, often fortified with sawdust, ground acorns, or other creative fillers, as wheat remains a rich man's fantasy. This loaf is no friend. You don't slice it, you negotiate with it. As for beverages, you're not sipping orange juice or an oat milk latte. You're drinking beer. Yes, beer. At 6 in the morning. Why? Because the water teems with parasites and filth. So, your day begins with weak ale, low alcohol, high survivability. Children partake as well. No one is thrilled, but at least it won't immediately kill you. Craving meat or cheese? Dream on. That's reserved for Sundays and saints' feast days, and only if your Lord is feeling generous. Most peasants consume meat only a few times annually. Fresh fruit? Only when seasonal and not already fermented in a wine. And don't even contemplate spices unless you're royalty. A mere pinch of pepper costs more than your monthly wages. Salt is precious enough to be secured under lock and key. So, you chew your gritty bread, gulp your medieval ale, and try not to ponder the rat that might have nibbled your porridge overnight. Breakfast doesn't energize you. It simply happens to you. And now that you're adequately underfed, it's time to toil as if your life depends on it, because it absolutely does. So, you've consumed your meager morning meal. Now it's time to dress. Not that it will offer much solace. Your wardrobe consists of precisely one outfit. 1. It's a coarse wool tunic or linen shift you've worn daily for months, possibly years. There's no concept of seasonal fashion. There's merely wearing this garment until it disintegrates or inflicts a skin malady. Underwear? Optional. If fortunate, perhaps a linen undertunic. Otherwise, you're unencumbered beneath layers of scratchy, sweat-soaked wool, all crudely stitched by someone who likely had no notion of a proper seam. There's no washing machine, no soap, and certainly no dry cleaner in sight. Consequently, your clothes are stained, stiff, and scented like a fermenting compost mound left to marinate in a pigsty. Even if you desire to wash them, it's an arduous task. You need to haul water from a river or well, heat it over a fire, scrub your tunic on a board with ashes or lye, and then hang it in the sun, which appears approximately 3 days a year. And don't even mention shoes. If you possess any, they're made of untreated leather, crudely stitched, and offer as much arch support as a limp fruit peel. Most peasants simply go barefoot, through mud, through dung, through unseen hazards like sharp rocks and disease-laden puddles. All this leads to one conclusion. Your skin despises you. You endure constant irritation. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs reside freely on your body. Everyone has them. Nobles, itchy monks, children who are mobile insectariums. No one escapes. You'll find yourself scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while conversing with a local priest, and no one will even bat an eye. Your skin is raw from incessant rubbing. Your scalp, a battlefield of bites. If a rash develops, too bad. There's no dermatologist, no hydrocortisone, no one to inform you it's likely scabies. You simply continue to suffer. If by some stroke of luck you avoid infection, splendid. That rash will merely accompany you for the next 6 months, an unwanted medieval sidekick. Now, clad in misery and discomfort, it's time to venture outside and commence toiling yourself into an early grave. Now that you're fully cloaked in discomfort and damp wool, it's time to flash that morning smile. Except you don't, because in the Middle Ages, smiling is a hazardous endeavor. Not emotionally, but dentally. There's no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, no floss. The concept of oral hygiene is about as popular as bathing, which is to say, not very. Some might chew on a twig or rinse with wine or vinegar. But for the most part, your teeth are left to their own devices, and they're not faring well. By your mid-20s, your smile resembles something unearthed from an ancient sepulcher. Cavities are rampant, gums are swollen, and those aren't just food stains on your teeth. That's decay. Your mouth hosts more rot than a damp root cellar. Sugar, though not yet ubiquitous, is becoming more common among the wealthy, imported at great cost, and primarily used in small cakes or as a display of affluence. If you're a noble, congratulations, you get to rot your teeth faster than the common folk. If you're poor, it's a slow decay over time, courtesy of fermented bread, gritty porridge, and years of hard chewing. Toothaches? Get accustomed to them. They're like the constant climate, always present in the background. The kind of pain that prompts thoughts of prayer, strong drink, or even pulling the tooth out yourself with pliers. And that's no joke. It was a legitimate treatment. Dentists were practically non-existent, but surgeon barbers filled the void. Yes, the same individual who trims your hair is also extracting your molars by candlelight with a crude hook and zero anesthesia. Infected tooth? Hope you enjoy fevers, because without antibiotics, it can swiftly escalate into sepsis and claim your life from a simple toothache. Indeed, the very condition that sends us to a pharmacy today could lead to your funeral in the 1300s. And there's no social reprieve either. Kissing? Good luck. Halitosis, or bad breath, is pervasive. If you're single, you're not judged by your smile. You're judged by your land and your livestock. In essence, your mouth is a battlefield, and it's losing the war. Now that your teeth throb, let's head outside because your real job, the one that will break your back, is just beginning. Time to head to work. Except there's no office, no desk, no leisurely pause, and no prospect of promotion. Your job, if you're like 90% of the population, is simple. Simply survive while toiling for someone else's comfort. You're a peasant. Congratulations. That means you cultivate land belonging to a lord who probably doesn't recall your name. You rise with the sun and cease only when it dips below the trees. Your tools, a wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever bones remain intact in your body. There's no weekend. There's no clocking out. There's only sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. Sunday is a day of rest, but only if you're not harvesting, fending off raiders, or fervently praying for your infected toe to stop turning black. The labor is brutal. Fields are plowed by hand or with oxen, if you're affluent enough to afford one. You dig ditches, sow seeds, pull weeds, and carry water until your spine begins to curve like a bow. No one cares if you're tired. No one inquires about your mental well-being. If you're a woman, surprise. You don't just perform field work. You also nurture children, clean, cook, spin wool, feed animals, and ignore the migrating parasite from your husband's hair, slowly making their way to your side of the bed. Children? They begin helping around age 5. No school, no toys, just a tiny wooden rake and a dream of one day not succumbing to the flu. If you're one of the few not farming, perhaps you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper. Great! You still work with fire, chemicals, or animal guts all day in stifling workshops. The pay? Basically, survival. The perks? Intermittent bleeding. Break a bone? Too bad. Get a fever? Drink some warm ale and persevere. You can't afford to stop, not even for a day. Because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a solution for that. It's called being replaced. So you grip your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. Because in the Middle Ages, your job isn't a career, it's a protracted trial of stamina. Now that your spine aches from laboring in the fields, let's talk about the weather. Because in the Middle Ages, temperature is less about distinct seasons and more about perpetual celestial torment. Let's begin with winter. There's no insulation, no central heating, and no weather stripping. Just wooden walls with gaping cracks you could almost throw a chicken through. Your windows are covered with cloth, not glass. The fire in the hearth? Nice in theory, but you lack sufficient firewood to sustain it, as wood is costly and gathering it from the forest is sometimes illegal. Yes, you could be executed for picking up the wrong stick from the wrong forest. You bundle up in your single damp wool tunic, huddle near the dying embers, and still wake with your nose frozen. Your feet are permanently cold, often damp. Your fingers so stiff they feel like tiny, frigid icicles. Frostbite isn't diagnosed. It's simply deemed bad luck. Now, fast forward to summer. Sounds better, right? Wrong. In summer, your home transforms into a sweltering kiln. There's no fan, no cross breeze, and absolutely no deodorant. You sweat profusely through your layers, but you cannot remove them because exposing too much skin is scandalous and also invites sunburn, insect bites, and social judgment. Flies are rampant, attracted to your soiled flesh and the scent of last week's goat stew still fermenting in the corner. Mosquitoes buzz by your ear as you sleep, assuming you can sleep through the sound of your neighbors yelling and babies crying. In the fields, the sun bakes you. No sunblock, no hat, unless you fashion one from straw like a makeshift scarecrow. And the worst part? You still have to work. Heat stroke is simply called a sudden decline, so you're either shivering in your humble dwelling, wondering if your toes will endure until spring, or you're sweating through your only pair of socks while your thighs become raw from friction. And the one constant, regardless of season, your clothes still itch, your food is still terrible, and your next task still awaits. Welcome to climate control, medieval style. There is none. Feeling parched? Need to refresh? Want to splash a little water on your face to awaken from this dismal, waking nightmare? Too bad. In medieval times, water isn't your ally. It's silently trying to poison you. Let's start with drinking. The nearby stream appears fresh, bubbling, and clear, like something from a romanticized tale. But spoiler alert, it's not. Upstream, someone just emptied a chamber pot into it. And if not that, then a dead pig is likely decomposing within. Parasites, bacteria, and the legions of microorganisms of medieval Europe await in every sip. That's why people drank beer. Yes, beer, even children. But before you imagine medieval youngsters engaged in wild revelry, understand that it was small beer, weak in alcohol, strong in survival. Brewing involved boiling the water, making it safer than whatever flowed through the town ditch. Wine was another option, if you were affluent enough to afford it and unconcerned with functioning properly before noon. What about bathing? Surely water was used for cleaning. In theory, yes. In practice, absolutely not. You see, back then, people believed bathing actually opened your pores and allowed disease to enter. That's right. Washing yourself was considered medically risky. You were apparently cleaner if you never removed the protective layer of filth caked onto your skin. Communal bathhouses did exist, but they quickly gained reputations as places for gossip, scandal, and sometimes boisterous communal activities. So, naturally, the church intervened and shut many down. Even if you did wish to bathe, it was a major undertaking. You need to fetch water from the well, boil it over a fire, fill a wooden tub that seeped, and then pray no one else in the house used it before you, or worse, after. And rainwater collected in open barrels where birds fowl, insects breed, and moss thrives. Sounds refreshing, doesn't it? So, whether it's going in your mouth, on your body, or onto your crops, water in the Middle Ages is less a life source and more a gamble. One wrong gulp, and you're spending your final days sweating in a straw bed, clutching your stomach, and contemplating all your life choices. Next time you sip tap water, raise a glass for our ancestors. They lacked the luxury of hydration without hazard. So, you drank the water. Or perhaps you didn't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like disappointment. Either way, you're ill. You need assistance. You require a doctor. Too bad you reside in the Middle Ages, where medicine is truly theological guesswork with sharp implements. Let's begin with the diagnosis. Everything ailing you, be it a cough, rash, broken bone, or the creeping pestilence is attributed to your humors being out of balance. The four humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medieval science, your health depended on maintaining their equilibrium, like some sort of internal cosmic concoction. Got a fever? Too much blood. The solution? Bloodletting. That's right. Let's drain your life force into a bowl using a blunt lancet or a ravenous leech. And yes, barbers were often the practitioners. Imagine receiving a haircut and a bloodletting session in one sitting. A dual service. Feeling sad or anxious? That's clearly an excess of black bile. The cure? Laxatives. Perhaps a warm herbal purge, or just prayers and a cold compress while everyone avoids eye contact and start carving your coffin. Now, if you break a bone or sustain a nasty wound, you're in real trouble. There's no anesthesia, unless you count losing consciousness from pain. Surgery is performed with knives that haven't been cleaned since the Crusades. Tools are heated over fire, not for sterilization, but because they simply look scarier that way. Antibiotics? Centuries away. Germ theory? Not invented yet. They believe disease originates from foul air or God's displeasure with your moral failings. Got a stomach ache? Must have been your sinful thoughts. Hope you enjoy confessing while vomiting. If your condition worsens, you'll be treated with more leeches, possibly some pulverized insects, and a priest at your bedside administering last rites, just in case. At this point, they're preparing for the cure known as death. And if, by some miracle, you recover, everyone simply assumes God took pity on you. The doctor claims full credit, and the leech gets promoted. So yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine is less about healing and more about surviving the cure. After a long day of labor, lice, and leeches, it's finally time to eat. You shuffle back to your humble dwelling, stomach growling, eager for the sole remaining joy in life, a warm meal. Bad news. Your meal is likely attempting to kill you. Let's start with the basics. Food preservation is practically non-existent. There's no fridge, no freezer, just salt, smoke, or the fleeting hope that winter air keeps things fresh. Your meat, if you're fortunate enough to possess any, has been hanging for days, swarming with flies, marinated in dubious brines, and possibly shared with a rat or two. Bread is the cornerstone of the medieval diet, but even that isn't safe. In lean harvest years, desperate peasants bulk it up with bark, sawdust, or even clay to make it stretch. And if it's rye season, there's a bonus: ergot, a fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like eating bread laced with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables? Only if they're seasonal. And you know what's always in season? Turnips. So many turnips. Boiled, mashed, or floating in pottage, which, if you recall, is basically a tepid mire of unknown components that's been simmering since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit might be available in the fall, but it rots quickly, and sugar is rare, expensive, and hoarded by the rich to display their blackened teeth. Dairy is another gamble. Fresh milk spoils in hours. Butter and cheese fare better, but they're loaded with bacteria. People consume them anyway because, frankly, it's either that or gnaw on your boot leather. And let's discuss seasoning. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg are worth more than gold. For the average peasant, flavor comes from onions, salt, if you're lucky, and pain. Most meals taste like wet burlap, sprinkled with sadness. But food isn't merely a health hazard. It's a political one. Game animals belong to the Lord, not you. Caught poaching a rabbit? You could be fined, imprisoned, or even executed. That's right. Your dinner could get you hanged. So, as you sit down to eat your gray stew by flickering firelight, remember, every bite is a risk. But you eat anyway, because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't nourish, it tests you. It's evening now. You've toiled, suffered, and barely digested your dubious broth. You might believe the day is winding down, but don't get too comfortable because God is watching. So is the priest, and so is your neighbor Agnes, who will absolutely report your absence if you miss Mass. In medieval Europe, religion isn't just a part of life, it is life. The church controls your calendar, your laws, your education, if you can read, your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between. Consider it your spiritual landlord, and you're perpetually in arrears. Every day is structured around sacred chimes. The town church bell rings morning, noon, and night, not merely as reminders, but because missing prayer is a sin. Forget to bow. Sin. Eat meat on a Friday. Sin. Contemplate your neighbor's wife in that one dream. Double sin. And yes, hell is palpably real. Priests describe it in glorious detail. Rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons with pitchforks, and eternal wailing. If the pestilence doesn't terrify you, eternal damnation definitely will. You cannot read the Bible yourself because it's written in Latin, a language reserved for monks, clergy, and that one noble child who's too refined for common grime. You rely on the church to interpret everything for you. That means if the priest declares your crop failure is due to insufficient prayer, well, time to kneel harder. Tithes, a tenth of everything you own, are mandatory. If you cultivate wheat, you yield wheat. If you raise chickens, you give eggs. If you possess nothing, congratulations. You're morally impoverished and fiscally ruined. Holidays? They're holy days. Dozens of them. And while they offer breaks from labor, they're not for amusement. They demand attending Mass, fasting, confessing sins, and reminding yourself that joy is a dangerous indulgence. Questioning the church is perilous. Heretics are burned, witches are drowned, blasphemers are flogged, and skeptics are swiftly reformed. So you go through the motions. You chant, you bow, you pray that your soul, after enduring this dirt-covered existence, might finally land in paradise, assuming the priest favors you. Because in the Middle Ages, God may be merciful, but the church, not so much. If you thought being a medieval peasant was rough, try doing it as a woman. All the squalor, famine, and fear, plus childbirth, subservience, and social invisibility. In the Middle Ages, being a woman is like being on an unforgiving difficulty setting with no health elixirs or reset option. From birth, a girl's life path is largely predetermined. Marry young, bear children, serve your husband, die tired. Education? Not likely. Unless you're from a noble family and sent to a convent, your intellectual development ceases around the time you learn how to prepare dairy and mend garments. Marriage occurs early, truly early. It's not uncommon to be betrothed at 12 and pregnant by 14. It's not about affection. It's about land, livestock, and alliances. Your opinion is not required. Once married, you are essentially your husband's property. Your role is to produce heirs, feed everyone, manage the household, and refrain from complaint. Because complaining might brand you a nag, or worse, a witch. That label comes with a complimentary execution by water or fire, depending on local custom. Childbirth is a lethal gamble. There's no prenatal care, no sterile instruments, no anesthesia. Midwives do their utmost, but even minor complications can mean death for the mother, the child, or both. Some women survive 10 pregnancies. Many do not survive 2. But don't worry, once the baby is born, your workload increases. Now you have a screaming infant in a vermin-infested hovel, and you're expected to nurse, cook, clean, and still assist in the fields. You receive no respite. You are the respite for everyone else. If you're unmarried, you're suspicious. If you're widowed, vulnerable. If you're outspoken, dangerous. Women who didn't conform were frequently accused of witchcraft, especially if they possessed herbal knowledge, a strong personality, or simply cast an unusual glance on a rainy Tuesday. Even within the church, your role is limited. Nuns lived under strict rules. No speaking without permission, no freedom of movement, and your spiritual worth always ranked below men. In short, if you're a woman in the Middle Ages, you're expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer in silence, ideally while smiling. Because even in an era of universal suffering, women were somehow expected to suffer gracefully. So far, you've endured squalor, hunger, societal inequities, and even livestock. But just when you think your day can't worsen, here comes violence, overtly brutal and frequently permissible by medieval standards. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were not peaceful. The concept of law and order largely meant hoping the local lord wasn't in a foul mood. Violence pervaded everything: the home, the streets, the battlefield, church disputes, and sometimes even the queue at the communal bread oven. Crime was rampant, punishment brutal, and justice more theatrical display than genuine safeguard. Steal a loaf of bread, and you could forfeit a limb. Accused of lying? Your tongue might be pierced. Gossip too much? Meet the scold's bridle, a metal mask strapped to your head with a bar in your mouth for correction, of course. Suppose you're accused of something serious: heresy, theft, witchcraft. How do you prove your innocence? By being tortured, obviously. Welcome to ordeal by trial. In one version, you plunge your hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If it heals without infection in 3 days, you're innocent. If not, you're guilty. Another option: you're tossed into a river. If you sink, you're innocent and likely dead. If you float, you're guilty and will be punished anyway. It's like an ancient game show where the prize is survival and the host actively roots against you. And if you're sentenced to death, that's a public event. Executions occur before cheering crowds. Hangings, beheadings, burnings. Sometimes people bring snacks. It's the medieval equivalent of mass entertainment. Domestic violence? Completely normal. Husbands were permitted, even expected, to discipline their wives and children. Street fights? Commonplace. You could be beaten simply for looking the wrong way at a noble's horse. And war? Always simmering. Local feuds, territorial disputes, religious crusades. Someone is always marching off to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or boredom. Violence isn't a breakdown of society in the Middle Ages. It is society. Everyone lives with the constant awareness that life is fragile, justice is arbitrary, and your neighbor might crush your skull over a pig. So walk carefully, keep your eyes down, and never trust anyone holding a club. At this point, you've navigated the parasites, the crude medicine, the unwashed discomfort, and the constant threat of disfigurement. But now comes the final chapter for most medieval lives: an early and inglorious death. If you're alive and still breathing past the age of 40, you're practically a celebrity. You might even be called the Old One. Less a nickname, more a demographic marvel. Let's break it down. Average life expectancy hovers around 30 to 40 years, but that figure is heavily skewed by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children perished before reaching age 5. Disease, malnutrition, or one harsh winter was all it took. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you survived childhood, you entered adulthood already exhausted. Work began as soon as you could walk upright, and by 25, your joints creaked like a creaking gate. You might be missing several teeth, a finger, and most of your original optimism. Women faced a particularly lethal trial: childbirth. It was a leading cause of death for medieval women. No pain relief, no medical intervention, just prayer, hot water, and someone clutching your hand as you bled out on a hay-filled pallet. For men, the dangers were different but equally relentless. Farming accidents, infections from minor wounds, a neighbor's drunken rage, an ill-fated crusade. Even a walk to market could be perilous if you encountered an idle brigand or an angry tax collector. Death could also arrive quietly, from the pestilence that transformed urban centers into graveyards overnight, or from famine that could last entire seasons, decimating entire villages. Or from sheer bad luck, like eating spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating and screaming at the walls. And funerals? You were lucky if you received one. Bodies were often buried quickly to prevent disease. No embalming, no polished coffins, just a hole, a few murmured prayers, and a shallow mound of earth if there was enough space left in the churchyard. So yes, in medieval times, life was brutal, short, and constantly besieged by death in all its casual forms. You didn't retire. You simply stopped showing up. And speaking of exits, let's turn to your final chapter: the medieval dream dies. So how has your day been? You've woken amid squalor, sought relief in a bucket, attempted oral hygiene with fleeting hope, nearly fainted from hunger, toiled until your back screamed for mercy, battled itchy wool, prayed to avoid pestilence, and narrowly escaped public execution for merely possessing a squirrel. Welcome to a single day in medieval Europe. Still dreaming of becoming a knight? Reconsider that idealized portrayal of the Middle Ages, chivalrous knights, noble ladies in towers, heroic battles, and feasts in candlelit great halls. It's a myth polished by fairy tales and fantasy books. In truth, the medieval world was gritty, cruel, and profoundly unjust. Hierarchy was everything. If you were born poor, you remained poor. If you were born rich, congratulations, you had a better chance of surviving. But you were still one bad soup away from dysentery and a hasty burial. Even the nobles weren't immune to misery. Castles were frigid stone fortresses, teeming with fleas, smoke, and politically motivated marriages. Sure, you possessed a fur cloak and a goblet of wine, but also a 50% chance of dying in a skirmish or from a septic wound. Not exactly luxury. The simpler times weren't simple, they were relentless. Everything took longer. Everything hurt more. Everything, from childbirth to chewing, carried severe consequences. Life was survival, not leisure. And if you did find a quiet moment to think, to dream, to imagine something better, there wasn't much you could do with it. No upward mobility, no modern medicine, no internet to Google this peculiar ailment. You lived, suffered, worked, and died within a 10-mile radius of your birthplace. But here's the wildest part. Through all of this, people still laughed, sang songs, told stories, fell in love, and found meaning. Not because life was easy, but because humans are remarkably resilient. Even in the darkest chapters, they cultivated pockets of joy. So tonight, when you slip into your clean bed with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and central heating, perhaps offer a quiet thank you to the modern world and to your ancestors who fought rats, famine, and feudalism so you wouldn't have to. Long before she was Catherine the Great, Empress of all Russia, mistress of reform, an icon of ambition, she was simply Fiona. Born Sophie Friederich August von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, she was the daughter of a relatively obscure German ducal house. Her tiny duchy in Pomerania offered little in terms of power. But Fiona herself possessed something no title could provide: keen intellect, unyielding charisma, and a quiet, burning hunger for greatness. Her upbringing was strict. Her mother, Johanna, was cold and calculating, not a warm, nurturing figure, but a status-obsessed social strategist. Fiona's father, a Prussian officer, was aloof rather than stern. From a young age, Fiona learned to walk the fine line between obedience and cunning. She read voraciously, spoke multiple languages, and learned how to observe a room before speaking in it, skills that would soon become survival tools in one of Europe's most treacherous courts. When the Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna began searching for a wife for her heir, Grand Duke Alexander, she looked beyond Russia's borders. Alexander himself was of German descent, and Empress Elizabeth believed a foreign bride, pliable and grateful, would be easier to control. Fiona fit the criteria perfectly: noble blood, Lutheran faith, which she'd be compelled to abandon, and a reputation for both grace and humility. At just 14 years old, Fiona was summoned to Russia. She arrived in the freezing capital of St. Petersburg in 1744, wearing thin German fabrics and a diplomatic smile. Her mother pushed her forward like a chess piece. Fiona, however, harbored her own game plan. To become acceptable in Russian society, she converted to Orthodoxy, adopting the name Ekaterina Alexeyevna. The ceremony was public, symbolic, and life-altering. She wasn't just changing religions. She was burning the bridge behind her, stepping into a foreign empire with no way back. No one observing that quiet teenage girl in a fur-trimmed coat could have predicted what would unfold next: betrayal, revolution, enlightenment, and empire. But from the moment Fiona stepped foot in the Russian court, she ceased being a pawn and began planning how to become a queen. Fiona's marriage to Grand Duke Alexander was intended to secure her place in Russian royalty, but from the very beginning, it felt more like confinement than a coronation. Alexander, heir to the Russian throne, was not the dashing prince of fairy tales. Ungainly, puerile, and obsessed with toy soldiers, he was far more interested in playing war games at his chambers than governing an empire or showing affection to his new wife. Some accounts even suggest he refused to consummate the marriage for years. He idolized Frederick the Great of Prussia and resented the Russian court that had adopted him. In contrast, Fiona embraced Russia with fierce determination. She learned the language, studied its history, and memorized Orthodox rituals. She yearned to belong. Alexander yearned to escape. This mismatch wasn't solely emotional. It was deeply political. The Russian court was a serpent's den of gossip, paranoia, and brutal power games. Empress Elizabeth still ruled with absolute authority, but her health was in decline. Everyone knew a transition was imminent, and everyone harbored an agenda. Fiona was constantly watched. Her letters were read, her friendships monitored, and her every move scrutinized. She couldn't trust her husband, her mother, who continued whispering in her ear on behalf of foreign interests, or even her servants. In this world, alliances could transform into accusations overnight. But Fiona was no fool. She learned to navigate the court's treacherous games, quietly cultivating allies in the shadows. She charmed military officers, befriended scholars, and cultivated a reputation for dignity and restraint, a stark contrast to her husband's puerile outbursts and open contempt for Russian traditions. Behind closed doors, Fiona began reading Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Montesquieu. While others saw her as a young consort, she was building a vision not just for herself, but for Russia, a nation of strength, education, and reason. But one problem persisted. The longer Alexander lived, the longer Fiona remained in limbo, a powerless wife to a man unfit to rule. So she waited, observed, and meticulously planned. She knew the Russian throne wouldn't be inherited. It would have to be seized. In 1762, after nearly 2 decades of waiting, observing, and quietly maneuvering, Fiona saw her moment and seized it with astounding swiftness. Empress Elizabeth had died, and Alexander, now Emperor Alexander III, was finally czar. But his reign began swiftly deteriorating. In just a few short months, Alexander antagonized the clergy, offended the nobility, insulted the army, and lavished praise on Prussia, Russia's longtime enemy. He reversed key policies, humiliated the clergy, and openly discussed divorcing Fiona to marry his mistress. The court, already wary of his erratic behavior, grew cold. The army, filled with generals loyal to Fiona, grumbled in corridors. Even ordinary Russians, devout and patriotic, viewed Alexander as a foreign puppet who mocked their traditions. Fiona, witnessing all of this unfold, made her move. In July of that same year, while Alexander was away at his summer palace, Fiona launched a swift, decisive overthrow. Supported by key military officers, including her lover Grigory Orlov and his influential brothers, she rode through St. Petersburg in full regalia, was proclaimed Empress Fiona II, and won the allegiance of the powerful imperial guard. Alexander, caught off guard and without allies, surrendered within days. He was taken into custody and shortly after found dead under mysterious circumstances. Officially, it was reported as an internal affliction. Unofficially, it was murder. Fiona was now empress, not by birth, not by marriage, but by will, intellect, and audacity. It was unprecedented. A foreign-born woman with no legitimate claim had taken the Russian throne without a single battle. But her real challenge was just beginning. She had to transform that bold grab for power into a lasting legacy. Would Russia accept her? Would the nobility respect her? Could she hold the empire together without falling victim to the same fate as her husband? Fiona understood that power gained through intrigue could be lost just as easily. She needed to rule not as a schemer, but as a visionary. And so began her transformation from a careful conspirator to a reforming empress, one who would redefine boundaries, champion enlightenment, and reshape what it meant to be a woman in power. Once Fiona had the crown, she could have rested on her power. But she didn't. She had something grander in mind than simply sitting on a throne. She wanted to transform Russia, and not just militarily or politically, but intellectually. While Alexander revered Frederick the Great and miniature figures, Fiona idolized Voltaire, Diderot, and the bold thinkers of the Enlightenment. She believed in reason, progress, education, and the role of a monarch as a servant of the people, even if she herself ruled with absolute authority. Fiona didn't just read Enlightenment philosophy. She lived it. She corresponded directly with Voltaire for over 15 years, flattering him while defending her absolute rule. She invited Diderot to her court and even purchased his entire library to support him financially. Behind closed doors, she pored over legal texts, debated reforms, and crafted policies to modernize the empire. Her early reign was filled with efforts to codify Russian law. She formed the Legislative Commission in 1767, an ambitious project intended to rewrite the entire legal code of Russia. Fiona's own guiding principles were a political manifesto in disguise, speaking of equality before the law, the dangers of torture, and the responsibility of rulers to serve the common good. For an empress in 18th century Russia, it was radical. But Enlightenment ideals had to contend with the realities of Russia, a vast, feudal, deeply conservative land ruled by nobles who preferred their serfs exactly where they were, beneath them. Fiona knew this. While she advocated reform, she moved carefully. She abolished some forms of torture, expanded access to secular education, and built schools and libraries. But she also reaffirmed the nobility's control over their serfs to maintain their loyalty. This was Fiona's balancing act, a philosopher queen in public, a practical empress in private. She walked a tightrope between ideology and survival, between the shining salons of Paris and the gritty politics of Moscow. Her vision for Russia was bold, but always calculated. In many ways, Fiona wasn't trying to make Russia European. She was trying to make Russia modern on her own terms. And that meant reform, yes, but with a firm resolve cloaked in diplomacy. Fiona wasn't content with reforming Russia from within. She wanted to expand it outward, to forge an empire worthy of fear, admiration, and envy. Where Peter the Great had opened a window to the west, Fiona aimed to dismantle boundaries. Under her leadership, Russia's borders stretched wider than ever before. She waged wars not merely to defend her crown, but to reshape the map of Europe. One of her most significant campaigns was against the Ottoman Empire. These wars, fought in waves throughout the 1760s and 1770s, weren't just about territory. They were about influence. Fiona saw herself as the liberator of Orthodox Christians living under Muslim rule, and as the rightful protector of Eastern Europe. Under renowned generals like Alexander Suvorov and Grigory Potemkin, Russia captured key regions, including Crimea, the northern coast of the Black Sea, and access to unrestricted maritime access, something Russian Tsars had coveted for generations. These victories weren't just military, they were symbolic. With each conquest, Fiona sent a message. Russia was no longer Europe's distant, underdeveloped kin. It was a continental force. She also turned her gaze westward. In a series of shrewd deals and diplomatic maneuvers, Fiona participated in the dismemberment of Poland, carving up the struggling Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth alongside Austria and Prussia. By the end of the Third Partition in 1795, Poland was erased from the map, and Russia claimed vast new lands and millions of new subjects. But Fiona didn't merely conquer with armies. She also colonized with ideas. New cities were built, trade routes were expanded, and German settlers were invited to cultivate Russian farmland. The empire became a mosaic, stretching from the icy Baltic to the sun-drenched shores of the Black Sea. And through it all, Fiona remained the central force, reading reports, issuing orders, and personally overseeing the shape of her expanding empire. Critics would accuse her of being power-hungry, even imperialistic. But for Fiona, expansion wasn't ambition, it was destiny. A great ruler, she believed, was measured not just by ideas, but by borders. She didn't just want to rule Russia. She wanted to remake it as a civilized empire, feared by its enemies, respected by its peers, and loyal to her alone. For all her brilliance and power, Fiona was equally famous for what transpired behind imperial chambers. And no, not all of it was whispered in libraries. Fiona's private life became one of the most talked about aspects of her reign. She had lovers, not just one or two, but a meticulously selected procession of them, many decades younger, often handsome, and sometimes politically influential. She didn't conceal them. In fact, she often rewarded them with titles, estates, and pensions if they conducted themselves well. If not, they were quietly dismissed, sometimes with a polite thank you and a promotion. Among the most important of these companions was Grigory Potemkin, a man as brilliant as he was bold. Their relationship blurred the lines between romance, politics, and partnership. Some historians believe they may have even married in secret. Together, they shaped military campaigns, colonization projects, and the transformation of southern Russia. Grigory wasn't merely a lover. He was her co-ruler in many respects. Still, Europe couldn't look past the scandal. Gossip swirled. Satirical pamphlets painted her as wanton, insatiable, even deranged. And after her death, the rumors only worsened, the most infamous being the completely false and grotesque tale involving an animal, spread by her enemies to smear her legacy. But why the obsession? Simple. Fiona was a woman who wielded power unapologetically. In a world where female rulers were expected to be either saintly virgins or tragic figures, she refused to play the role. She lived, loved, and ruled on her own terms, and that made her dangerous. Ironically, while her critics branded her immoral, Fiona herself was deeply philosophical about love and sexuality. She believed pleasure was a natural part of life, and that personal relationships didn't have to threaten public responsibility. She separated emotion from governance, a feat few male rulers managed. In reality, her liaisons were often strategic. She surrounded herself with men who were loyal, capable, and politically useful. And when they ceased to be, she released them, usually with a smile and a generous retirement. Fiona's love life didn't diminish her rule. It was part of her strategy, a blend of passion and power that made her unforgettable, envied, and feared. For all her charisma and control, Fiona's reign was not without peril. And in 1773, that peril manifested as a shaggy Cossack named Yemelian Pugachev. He was no ordinary rebel. Pugachev claimed to be none other than Alexander III, Fiona's supposedly deceased husband. According to him, he had survived the coup and now returned to reclaim the throne from the foreign claimant. It was absurd. Alexander was long gone. But to Russia's oppressed and exhausted lower classes, the claim didn't need to be true. It just needed to offer hope. Pugachev promised liberation, an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and land for the common people. His words ignited fervor across the Volga River region, especially among the Cossack peasantry and devout Old Believers. In an era when the chasm between nobles and serfs had brutally widened, his promises sounded like salvation. The Pugachev Rebellion became the largest peasant uprising in Russian history. Towns were captured, fortresses fell, and nobles were slaughtered. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as if the empire itself might fracture. Fiona was shaken. This wasn't a foreign war she could win with cavalry and treaties. This was a revolt from within her own people, rising against the system she ruled. But Fiona didn't panic. She acted. She dispatched professional military forces to crush the rebellion ruthlessly. Pugachev's forces were defeated in 1774. He was captured, displayed in an iron cage, and eventually beheaded in Moscow, a stark deterrent to all who dared follow. Afterward, Fiona intensified her grip on order and control. Her aspirations for serf liberation gradually receded into silence. The rebellion had shown her the limits of enlightenment in a country still shackled by feudalism. She now leaned harder on the nobility, who offered loyalty in exchange for absolute control over their serfs. This was a turning point. The empress who once quoted Voltaire now prioritized stability over philosophy. Reform became cautious. Surveillance increased. Rebellion, even whispered, was to be stomped out before it could even draw breath. Pugachev may have lost his head, but he left behind a warning that haunted Fiona. That power built on inequality could only endure for so long before the storm came crashing through. By the time Fiona approached the final years of her life, she had ruled Russia for over 3 decades, longer than any female ruler in Russian history. From the moment she seized power, she had defied expectations, reshaped her empire, and redefined what a woman and a monarch could be. Under Fiona's reign, Russia became a true European powerhouse. Its territory expanded by over 200,000 square miles, incorporating Crimea, parts of Poland, and stretches of the Black Sea coast. These weren't just military victories. They were strategic pivots, securing strategic maritime access and reshaping trade. But her legacy wasn't solely drawn on maps. Fiona left an enduring cultural imprint as well. She helped found the renowned Hermitage Museum, amassed one of the greatest art collections in Europe, and corresponded with the foremost thinkers of the Age of Reason. Her court became a center of sophistication, art, and intellectual ambition. In a country often viewed as primitive by Western standards, Fiona firmly placed Russia on the cultural map. She modernized education, founding schools for girls and promoting the printing of books. She introduced variolation to Russia, even publicly receiving the vaccine herself, an act of medical courage in her time. Yet, her reign was also one of contradictions. While she admired Enlightenment ideals, she never freed the serfs. In fact, she extended serfdom further into Russia's territories. Her reforms, while impressive, remained mostly centralized, designed to polish the empire without truly transforming its fundamental structures. Still, Fiona's rule brought stability and ambition. She understood that power was not inherited. It was crafted, managed, and constantly defended. She ruled not by divine right, but by force of will, political brilliance, and relentless calculation. She was called many things: usurper, autocrat, innovator, enchantress. But above all, she was effective. When she died in 1796, Russia was wealthier, larger, and more formidable than it had been in centuries. She left behind a secure throne, an expanded empire, and a legend that would endure for centuries. Fiona didn't just reign. She ruled with intellect, strategy, and an unapologetic grip on history. And in doing so, she became more than an empress. She became a myth. For all her power, expansion, and enduring legacy, Fiona was still at her core a woman navigating a man's world and reshaping it in her image. Behind the imperial portraits and state decrees was someone deeply aware of how tenuous her position was. She was not born Russian. She came to the throne through a coup. She ruled an empire that didn't desire a woman in charge. And yet, she not only endured, she thrived. Fiona was never content to be merely ornamental. She read constantly, wrote endlessly, and never ceased learning. Her daily schedule was intense. Hours of reading reports, corresponding with foreign powers, editing state papers, and managing a court teeming with rival factions. She wasn't content to simply sit on the throne. She governed the realm like a natural stateswoman. She was also, in many ways, solitary. She surrounded herself with courtiers, lovers, and artists, yet wrote in her memoirs how few individuals she could truly rely on. Her son, Paul, whom she distrusted and kept away from state matters, grew into a man she feared would undo all her progress. Her greatest emotional partnership with Grigory's influence faded into deep friendship, but his death in 1791 left a wound that never truly healed. Fiona crafted her image carefully. She understood the power of narrative and wielded it better than most monarchs of her age. She posed as the maternal figure of Russia, enlightened ruler, formidable empress, and artistic patron. But beneath those roles was a woman who had endured rejection, betrayal, scandal, and rebellion and kept going. When she died in 1796, she left behind an empire transformed, but also questions. Could she have done more to end serfdom? Were her Enlightenment ideals compromised by politics? Was she more reformer or ruler? History remembers her by the title, She Never Gave Herself. The Great, it wasn't because she was flawless or kind or just. It was because she seized power and wielded it on her own terms in a time and place where women weren't supposed to have any. She didn't just wear the crown. She redefined the very essence of regal right. In the humid depths of the Chiapas jungle in southern Mexico, the ruins of ancient La Cama whisper stories from the ancient Maya world. Towering temples rise above the canopy, their limestone faces eroded by time, but still brimming with secrets. And in 1994, one of those secrets revealed itself. A team of Mexican archaeologists led by Fanny Lopez Jimenez was surveying Temple 3, a relatively modest pyramid next to the more famous temple of the texts, the burial site of the mighty Great Serpent King. Temple 3 wasn't expected to hold much until they noticed something odd, a sealed, hidden chamber beneath the structure. No looters had touched it. It was pristine. When the archaeologists broke through and lowered themselves inside, they found a stone sarcophagus resting in silence. The air was heavy with the weight of centuries. As they opened the lid, red dust rose like smoke, brilliant, shocking scarlet. The interior was covered in vermilion cinnabar powder, a toxic mercury compound used ceremonially by the Maya. And lying within that crimson haze was the skeleton of a woman. She had been buried with care and reverence. Her bones were fragile but intact, her skull still wearing a jade mask, and her body surrounded by funerary offerings, necklaces, diadems, ear spools, all crafted from jade and shell. Everything about the burial screamed royalty. Yet no name was inscribed. No glyphs identified her. It was one of the richest female burials ever found in Mesoamerica, and yet it was a total enigma. Why was she buried in red powder? Who was she? Was she a queen, a priestess, or perhaps even the great king's wife? The researchers called her the Red Queen, and the name stuck. But even with modern forensics, they couldn't say for sure who she was, only that she had lived around the 7th century during the golden age of La Cama. Unlike most Maya tombs, hers had been hidden, untouched, and purposefully isolated. Her burial wasn't just ceremonial, it was spiritual. This woman wasn't meant to be remembered with words. She was meant to be remembered through ritual, through color, and through the mystery she left behind. The most haunting feature of the lady's resting place wasn't her jade jewelry or the silence of the sealed chamber. It was the red dust. A thick layer of fine cinnabar dust covered everything. The sarcophagus, the walls, her bones, even the offerings around her. It clung like blood to stone. To the Maya, this was no accident. Cinnabar, made from crushed mercury ore, was one of the most sacred and dangerous substances in the ancient world. Its vibrant red color wasn't just aesthetically captivating. It symbolized blood, rebirth, and the life force that connected the human and divine realms. Red was sacred. It was the color of sunrise, of sacrifice, of life reborn from demise. And it wasn't just symbolic, it was spiritual. Covering the dead in cinnabar was a ritual meant to transform the body, preserving it not for eternity, but for transition. In Maya belief, death wasn't the end. It was a passage, a crossing into another cosmic layer. And so the Red Queen, whoever she was being prepared not just for burial, but for divine apotheosis. But there's another layer to this. Cinnabar is toxic. Repeated exposure can lead to mercury-induced tremors, hallucinations, even death. The Maya likely didn't understand the chemistry, but they intuitively felt its potency. It was potent, perilous, dangerous. To bathe the corpse in it was to declare this person was no ordinary mortal. In La Cama, very few were buried with cinnabar. The Great Serpent King, the mighty ruler whose pyramid dominates the site, was one. His body, like hers, was also saturated in the red powder. That detail alone drew speculation. Was the Red Queen his wife, his mother, or someone of equal divine status? Her skull had been placed on a layer of jaguar skin, another sacred symbol. Around her, bone needles, obsidian blades, and miniature jade figurines hinted at rituals performed either during her life or in her honor at death. Every part of her burial told a story without words, a story of power cloaked in secrecy. A woman prepared to cross into the underworld, not in silence, but in ceremony drenched in the color of sacrifice. Surrounding the Red Queen's scarlet-bathed remains was a world of silence, broken only by the gleam of jade, shell, and obsidian. These were not mere ornaments. They were offerings, each one carefully chosen to accompany her on the journey to the Maya afterlife. Zabalba. At her sides were jade necklaces, heavy and cold, their polished surfaces still glowing after centuries entombed. Jade was not just beautiful, it was sacred. The Maya considered it a symbol of eternal life. It represented the green of maize, the vitality of the jungle, and the breath of the gods. Only the elite were buried with jade. For the Red Queen, it covered her chest, wrists, and ears, a clear sign that in life she wielded influence, perhaps even celestial grace. One of the most haunting objects was the jade sepulchral mask, placed delicately over her face. Unlike the golden death masks of Egypt, this one was subtle, constructed from numerous small mosaic pieces arranged to mimic the contours of her skull. The mask served a ritual function, to protect the soul, to preserve identity, and to present her as divine in the eyes of the gods. Scattered near her bones were bone needles, obsidian blades, and shell artifacts. These could have been ceremonial implements or symbols of her status as priestess, curer, or royal matriarch. One bone pin was engraved, faint but purposeful, a small echo of her lost voice. At her feet and along the edges of the tomb were ceramic vessels, still sealed, likely once filled with offerings, food, drink, or incense to sustain her spirit beyond death. The Maya believed the afterlife was a dangerous, layered journey filled with challenges. These items weren't luxuries, they were necessities. The tomb feels intimate, not overloaded, but intentional. There was no gold, no chariots, no pomp, just items chosen with spiritual weight. It was a map for the soul. Through these treasures, we glimpse how the Maya understood death not as finality, but as a transition of power. The Red Queen wasn't buried to be forgotten. She was being prepared to ascend. For all the grandeur of her tomb, the Red Queen left behind one haunting void. No name, no inscriptions adorned her sarcophagus. No glyphs on the walls identified her. She was clearly someone powerful, but who? From a moment her tomb was opened, scholars began trying to connect the dots. The most compelling theory is that the Red Queen was Nine-Tizek-Buajah, the wife of Kinich Janab, Pakal, known today as the Great Serpent King, the most famous ruler of Lakama. Nine-Tizek-Buajah was more than just the Great King's consort. She was born into nobility and married into Lakama's royal dynasty at a young age. She bore at least 3 sons, all of whom held high status, and she played a key ceremonial role during her husband's reign. If anyone could be buried with such honor, it was her. Supporting this theory was the tomb's location, just a few feet away from the Great King's own grand burial in the Temple of the Texts. The proximity suggests a deliberate pairing, husband and wife rulers, even in death. And then there's the cinnabar. Only 2 burials in Lakama were found with such intense cinnabar coverage, the Great King and the Red Queen. It's unlikely this was coincidence. But here's where the mystery deepens. DNA tests were conducted on both sets of remains in hopes of confirming the connection. But the results were inconclusive. The woman's bones showed no direct maternal link to the Great King. But that didn't rule out a spousal relationship. After all, marriage does not require shared blood. Some have argued she could have been Sak-Kuk, the Great King's powerful mother, who ruled Lakama before he came of age. Others suggest she may have been a high priestess, a sister, or a royal ancestor whose name has simply been lost to history's erosion. Still, the evidence points most strongly to Nine-Tizek-Buajah, a reigning queen, a mother of potent rulers, and a divine partner to the great king. The lack of a name may not be an oversight. It may have been intentional. In Maya cosmology, the soul lived on not through monuments, but through ritual, symbol, and the whispers of the earth. And so the Red Queen remained suspended between legend and truth, a woman who ruled, remembered not in stone, but in scarlet and silence. To understand the Red Queen, we must understand the world she came from, a world where Maya women, especially royal ones, wielded more influence than many realize. In Maya civilization, politics was often a family affair. Royal women weren't merely passive consorts. They were diplomats, priestesses, and power brokers. They conducted rituals, sponsored temples, and played crucial roles in maintaining dynastic legitimacy. Their bloodlines were political capital, used to forge alliances and secure claims to the throne. Take Satkuk, for example, the mother of the great Serpent King. When the throne of Lakama was left vacant, she took power herself and ruled as queen regent until her son came of age. She wasn't a placeholder. She was a ruler in her own right, issuing decrees and overseeing construction projects. Without her, the great king may never have risen at all, and she wasn't an anomaly. Across the Maya world, in places like Yaxchilan, Naranjo, and Calakmul, inscriptions show women performing major ceremonies, engaging in warfare, diplomacy, and sometimes ruling outright. They were often portrayed in stele and murals, dressed in elaborate headdresses and regalia, standing beside kings as equals or sometimes above them. Their words were carved in glyphs. Their names were remembered until they weren't. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, much of that memory had eroded. The European perspective viewed indigenous women as subservient figures in a male-dominated world. But the archaeology tells a different story, one of complex gender roles where power was negotiated, not simply inherited. This context casts the Red Queen in a new light. She may not have ruled in name, but her burial, rich, sacred, and positioned beside the great king, suggests she was a central pillar in the royal order. Her jade mask wasn't just decoration. It was a symbol of identity, of power held in life and protected in death. Her bloodline may have been the very glue that held Lakama's dynasty together. In Maya civilization, a queen wasn't just a queen. She was a keeper of sacred lineage, a voice in ceremony, and often the bridge between gods and men. The Red Queen may be nameless, but in her world, she was never voiceless. The Red Queen wasn't just buried with treasures. She was interred within architecture rich with purpose, layered with Maya cosmology, ritual symbolism, and intentional design. Her tomb wasn't merely a grave. It was a gateway to eternity. Her body was discovered inside Temple 3, one of the smaller pyramids within the heart of Lakama. Yet, its proximity to the Temple of the Texts, the resting place of the great Serpent King, is telling. These temples weren't built randomly. Their positioning was sacred, guided by astrology, myth, and dynastic legacy. Temple 3 rises modestly compared to its grand neighbor, but it conceals something even more intimate, a sealed crypt, untouched by looters, perfectly preserved. It was constructed deep within the temple's core, accessible only by a steep, narrow staircase. The descent into her tomb feels almost symbolic, a ritual journey downward into the underworld. The chamber itself is stark, crafted from cut stone, sealed for over 13 centuries. No glyphs or murals cover the walls. No ornate carvings tell her story. But perhaps that silence is intentional. This was a space not for the living to interpret, but for the dead to transform. At the center, her sarcophagus sits like an altar, fashioned from limestone. It echoes the grand stone coffin of the great king next door. While the great king's lid is famously engraved with scenes of cosmic rebirth, the Red Queen's tomb is more subdued. The focus is inward, on the body, on the cinnabar, on the ritual of death itself. And yet there are subtle architectural cues that hint at meaning. The tomb is aligned east to west, a symbolic path mirroring the sun's journey from life to death. The chamber is small, but powerful. It feels deliberate, personal, a sacred enclosure for someone revered. Maya temples were cosmological tools, bridges between the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. To be buried in one was to be elevated beyond the human realm. The Red Queen's eternal home wasn't an afterthought. It was a carefully constructed shrine, a place where death became transformation. Her bones rest in stone, her essence in cinnabar, and her legacy in the architecture itself. A temple that speaks without words, telling us she mattered. To the ancient Maya, death wasn't the end. It was a threshold, a sacred passage into the underworld known as Xibalba. And for someone like the Red Queen, this crossing was not only spiritual, it was political, cosmological, and deeply ritualized. Burial rituals were carefully choreographed events, rooted in myth and intended to guide the soul through the treacherous layers of the underworld. Maya texts and iconography indicate that Xibalba was no peaceful afterlife. It was a maze of darkness, rivers of blood, trials, and gods of death. Only those properly interred, ritually prepared, and spiritually equipped could successfully complete the journey. The Red Queen was buried, wrapped in cinnabar, encased in stone, and surrounded by offerings, all signs of an elite burial. But there's more. The presence of bone needles and obsidian blades in her tomb hints at self-sacrifice rituals, possibly symbolic tools representing rites she had performed in life or that were reenacted at her burial to empower her spirit. Her sepulchral mask, meticulously assembled from jade tiles, was not simply decorative. It may have served as a sacred receptacle, preserving her face and identity as she journeyed into the afterlife. In Maya belief, the face was a reflection of the spirit, and the soul needed to be recognized by the gods. The ceramic vessels surrounding her may have once held chocolate, maize water, or even pulque to nourish her in the next world. Other items, like stingray spines or shell trumpets, could have represented spiritual tools, calls to the gods, or tokens of ritual communication. Burial wasn't just a farewell, it was a transformation. The Maya believed in cycles, death as seed, burial as planting, and the afterlife as rebirth. Kings and queens were often seen as earthly incarnations of gods, and in death, they returned to those divine origins. The Red Queen, covered in the color of blood, entombed in a pyramid, and honored with offerings, was being prepared for rebirth, not as a mortal, but as a being tied to the sacred order of the cosmos. Her burial wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her legend. Just a few steps away from the Red Queen's final resting place lies one of the most renowned sepulchres in Mesoamerica, that of Kinich Janab Pakal, known simply as the Great Serpent King. His burial inside the Grand Temple of the Texts is celebrated for its artistry, scale, and deeply spiritual symbolism. But what makes the Red Queen's tomb so extraordinary is not only what was inside, it's where it was found. Her sarcophagus was hidden within Temple 3, directly adjacent to the Great King's monument. In a city like Lakama, where every temple was meticulously positioned to reflect cosmic principles, this closeness was no coincidence. It was intentional, a statement etched in stone. Many scholars believe the Red Queen was Nine-Tizek-Buajah, the Great King's queen and trusted consort. While her tomb lacks inscriptions, the similarities between their burials are striking. Both wrapped in cinnabar, both entombed in pyramids, both buried with jade, and both treated with extreme reverence. These rituals mirror each other, as if two halves of a sacred narrative. The Great King's lid famously depicts him falling into the underworld tree, a cosmic scene of death and rebirth. The Red Queen's simpler tomb contains no such iconography, but the symbolism lies in the pairing itself. If the Great King represented the sun journeying through the underworld at night to rise again, then the Red Queen may have represented the moon, the feminine force that follows its own mysterious path in the sky. Together, they embodied a cosmic duality, masculine and feminine, king and queen, sun and moon, order and ritual. In Maya mythology, rulership was not singular. It was relational. Harmony in the cosmos required balance. And that balance extended into the dynastic court. By placing the Red Queen beside the Great King, the Maya were preserving not just a marriage, but a cosmic partnership. Their proximity in death may have mirrored their roles in life. A queen not behind, but beside her king, sharing not just a throne, but a legacy. In their tombs, they speak without words. Two souls wrapped in cinnabar and stone, joined across eternity. One of history's most sacred silences. Though her name was lost to time, the Red Queen of Lakama endures not as a forgotten relic, but as one of the most mysterious and influential women of the ancient world. Her tomb, sealed for over 13 centuries, now whispers across millennia, inviting questions that echo louder with every discovery. She represents a mystery that still defies complete comprehension. We may never know exactly who she was. No glyph carved her name. No stela told her story. And yet the meticulous care in her burial, the richness of her offerings, the symbolism of her scarlet-stained remains, all speak of a woman profoundly important, not merely as a wife or consort, but as someone who held real influence, spiritual weight, and royal blood. Today, the Red Queen compels us to reevaluate assumptions. She's a reminder that in the ancient Maya world, women were not silent. They led rituals, governed cities, and shaped dynasties. While kings like the Great Serpent King have long dominated the spotlight, the Red Queen's reemergence reminds us that power did not belong to men alone. It flowed through mothers, queens, priestesses, and visionaries. Her legacy is more than the treasure she left behind. It's the conversation she sparked among archaeologists, historians, artists, and storytellers. Every jade bead, every layer of cinnabar, every architectural choice in Temple 3 tells us something deliberate. This woman mattered. And perhaps that's the most extraordinary part of her story. Not what we know, but what we still don't. The Red Queen teaches us that history isn't just a collection of facts. It's a living puzzle, a shared human longing to connect with the past. In that sense, her legacy is still unfolding. She lies wrapped in red, the color of life and sacrifice, of blood and rebirth. Her face, once hidden behind a jade mask, now stares back at us through science, art, and wonder. She remains nameless but not voiceless, mysterious but not forgotten. The Red Queen may have ruled a kingdom in life, but in death, she rules something greater, our imagination. Her tomb was sealed in stone. Her story was written in silence. And still, somehow she speaks. Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in a vibrant district of Coyoacán, then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. Her childhood home, the Blue House, Casa Azul, was filled with color, contradiction, and quiet strength. It would later become a sanctuary, a battleground, and a museum dedicated to one of the seminal artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of 4 daughters born to Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilda Calderon, a devout Catholic of indigenous and Spanish descent. Her parents were opposites. Guillermo, reserved and intellectual. Matilda, religious and emotionally distant. Frida would inherit her father's introspection and artistic eye, but also her mother's fierce resilience. As a child, Frida was imaginative, candid, and daring. She read voraciously and posed questions most adults didn't want to answer. But at the age of 6, she contracted polio, which left her right leg slimmer and less robust than the other. A physical difference she tried to mask with long skirts, but never allowed to limit her spirit. The illness left her bedridden for months and isolated from other children. During this time, she grew close to her father, who encouraged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and stay mentally sharp. Unlike most girls of her time, Frida didn't aspire to become a wife or a homemaker. Her goal, to become a doctor. She enrolled in the esteemed National Preparatory Institute in Mexico City at age 15, one of only a handful of girls accepted. There, she stood out not just for her intelligence, but for her rebellious wit, radical thought, and unique sense of style. She joined a group of young intellectuals known as Los Cachuchas, who debated philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was drawn to revolution, to ideas that challenged tradition. But even in those early years, before the bus crash that would define her body and before the fame that would define her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into the world with sharp edges, unapologetic ideas, and an identity too vast to fit inside anyone else's expectations. She wasn't just growing up in Coyoacán. She was preparing to remake herself entirely. On September 17th, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life was split in two: the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon, she boarded a wooden bus with her boyfriend, Alejandro Gomez Arias, after school. They were laughing, teasing each other, and probably arguing. Frida never did anything halfway. But moments later, the bus collided with a streetcar, and in an instant, her future dissolved into agony, twisted metal, and silence. The crash was horrific. The streetcar crushed the bus against a wall, splintering wood and flinging passengers. Frida was pierced by a metallic handrail. It entered her left hip and exited through her pelvis. Her spinal column fractured in multiple locations. Her right leg was shattered. Her foot dislocated. Her collarbone and ribs broke. Her shoulder was dislocated. Her abdomen was pierced. She was just 18 years old. A man covered her with a borrowed overcoat. Someone else noticed her body was sparkling, not from blood, but from the gleaming gold dust she had been carrying in a pouch. It had exploded on impact, dusting her broken form in what looked like glittering ash. Frida was taken to the Red Cross hospital and underwent numerous operations over the following months. She spent weeks in a body cast, flat on her back, motionless, writhing with infection and uncertainty. The future she'd imagined of becoming a doctor slipped further away with every passing day. But in that stillness, something began to stir. Her father gave her brushes. Her mother rigged a custom easel to hang above her bed. A mirror was placed on the canopy so she could see herself. And there, lying in plaster and agony, Frida began to paint. First out of boredom, then out of obsession. Her first subjects were her own reflection because she was all she had. But what emerged wasn't vanity. It was survival. The crash had broken her physically, but it had also opened a door into her own mind, her own body, and eventually into the surreal language of pain and identity that would define her art. The girl who wanted to heal others now began healing herself, one brush stroke at a time. As Frida Kahlo lay bound by plaster and rigid steel, a body at war with itself, with every breath, she began to paint. What started as a form of therapy soon became a language. And that language was deeply personal, unflinchingly candid, and often hard to look at, which was precisely the point. Frida didn't paint pretty flowers or polite landscapes. She painted pain, her pain, physical, emotional, and existential. Her first subjects were self-portraits, not because she was vain, but because, as she famously said, "I paint myself because I'm so often alone, and because I'm the subject I know best." Her early works were small in scale, painted on tin or wood panels, inspired by Mexican retablos, devotional paintings meant to tell stories of suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition inward. Her body became the canvas. Her emotions became the altar. She painted herself as split, as pierced, as bleeding. In one painting, she is impaled by nails like a modern-day martyr. In another, she floats in a barren landscape, tethered to a broken column, a metaphor for her shattered spine. She painted herself weeping, fractured, decapitated, and bare, but never passive, always watching. Her pain was not sanitized. She painted the ugliness of trauma with beauty, defiance, and even humor. Each piece was a reclamation of her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a world that often tried to define her. But Frida wasn't just telling her story. She was inventing a new kind of visual narrative, one that blended Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and symbolism. Her paintings became dreamlike autopsies of her soul, framed in color, culture, and myth. By the time she recovered enough to walk again, albeit painfully, Frida was no longer the girl who had wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art was unlike anything anyone had seen. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into a source of creation. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint her pain. She compelled the world to look at it, and in doing so, she transformed suffering into a sacred act of self-expression. In 1928, still recovering, still painting, and just 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the most significant and tumultuous connection of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years her senior, already Mexico's most famous painter. Colossal in both physique and demeanor, Rivera was a giant of Mexican muralism, known for his expansive, politically resonant murals that narrated the story of the Mexican people. Frida had seen his work before. She admired it. But now, she desired his opinion of her own creations. She brought her paintings to him at the Ministry of Education, interrupting his scaffold work to ask bluntly, "Do I have talent?" Diego took one look and replied, "Yes, and not just out of kindness." He recognized in her something rare, an unvarnished voice, raw and authentic, brimming with rage, irony, pain, and beauty. They began a relationship as consuming as it was creative. Frida once famously remarked, "I suffered 2 accidents in my life, one in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other was Diego." They married in 1929, an odd pairing to outsiders. Diego, massive, unfaithful, politically renowned. Frida, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, already walking with a cane. Her parents famously dubbed it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was passionate but chaotic. Diego supported her art and encouraged her growth as a painter. But he was also endlessly unfaithful, even with Frida's own sister, Cristina. Frida was devastated, and in turn, she took lovers of her own, both men and women, including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and painter Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939, then remarried a year later with different terms. This time, Frida would maintain her autonomy, her home, her money, her name. Their second marriage was less about traditional love and more about creative partnership and mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals and heartbreak, Diego remained a constant force in Frida's life. He challenged her, he wounded her, but he also believed in her as an artist, as a revolutionary, and as a woman who could redefine what painting could truly be. Together, their existence was not peaceful, but it was legendary. In the 1930s, Frida Kahlo accompanied Diego Rivera on a journey north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York as he completed prominent mural assignments. These years abroad brought her face to face with American industrial might, accumulating wealth, and capitalistic paradoxes, leaving her with profound political unease. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and an admirer of indigenous traditions. The opulence she witnessed in the United States, especially while the Great Depression ravaged much of the country, only deepened her sense of disillusionment. In letters home, she derided the societal materialism and obsession with appearances. She yearned for the grit, color, and contradiction of Mexico. While Diego painted enormous murals on factory walls, Frida began to paint smaller, intimate, subtle revolts, deeply personal works on tin and canvas. Her style solidified, sharp, surreal, emotional, and intimate. It was during this period that she produced some of her most seminal self-renderings. Frida didn't just paint herself for vanity. She painted herself to survive. Her identity became her landscape. With her form perpetually afflicted by pain from her accident, multiple surgeries, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit, she turned inward. Her portraits depicted her bleeding, fractured, vulnerable. Yet her face was always calm, always direct, unapologetic. One of her most powerful works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying on a hospital bed, crying, surrounded by floating symbols of loss, a fetus, a snail, medical equipment, a cracked pelvis. It was visceral, explicit, and profoundly moving, a canvas that bled with truth. Back in Mexico, Frida immersed herself in leftist politics. She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he lived in exile. Frida wore vibrant Tehuana garments, traditional indigenous clothing, not just as fashion, but as a political and cultural statement. Her art was never disconnected from her beliefs. Her identity, her body, and her ideology all intertwined in her work. While Rivera painted murals of revolution, Frida painted its human cost, the body in pieces, the mind on fire, and the self always staring back. In exile and in illness, she became not just a painter of pain, but a painter of resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico in the late 1930s, she was no longer just Diego Rivera's wife. She had become something else entirely, a force, an artist whose work radiated with raw honesty, surreal symbolism, and profound cultural identity. Back in her homeland, she stepped fully into herself. Her blue house, Casa Azul, in Coyoacán became a haven of vibrancy and paradox. Bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, Aztec statues in the garden, monkeys and parrots wandering freely. The house was a living extension of Frida's imagination. It was a blend of tradition and rebellion, elegance and earth. Here, she surrounded herself with pre-Columbian artifacts, ex-votos, folk art, and revolutionary books. She wore bold Tehuana dresses, wove flowers into her hair, and painted amid the scent of copal incense and the sounds of mariachi on the street outside. This period marked a burst of artistic output. Her paintings became more intricate, more symbolic, and more political. Works like the two Fridas reveal the divided self. One in European dress with a bleeding heart, the other in indigenous clothing, strong and composed. It was Frida's visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and heritage. In 1939, she exhibited her work in Paris, where artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her fiercely original style. But even among the surrealists, Frida stood apart. When André Breton tried to label her as one of their own, she pushed back. They thought I was a surrealist, she said, but I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality. She painted Mexico, not the romantic postcard version, but the living, breathing country she adored. Her work pulsed with symbolism: skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, corn, and blood. She honored the indigenous roots of her homeland while unmasking the violence of its past and present. But even as her artistic voice grew stronger, her health continued to decline. Multiple surgeries, infections, and chronic pain became daily realities. Still, she painted through it, propped up in bed, torso bound in corsets, fingers clenched around the brush. Frida had returned to Mexico not to rest, but to reclaim her power through paint, through politics, and through her fearless embrace of the self. As the 1940s progressed, Frida Kahlo's physical form persisted in failing her. Her spine was deteriorating. Her right leg was constantly infected. She underwent over 36 operations in her lifetime, often in arduous sequence. At times, she was bedridden for months, bound by plaster casts or immobilized by traction devices that stretched her bones apart. But still she painted. Each canvas during these years became both a release and an act of resistance. Her works grew darker, more defiant. She painted with a perceptiveness honed by suffering, refusing to hide behind metaphor. In the broken column, she presents herself split down the middle, her body pierced with nails, a cracked ionic column replacing her spine. Yet her face is stoic, her gaze unflinching. Pain, for Frida, was no longer just a subject. It was her companion, her antagonist, her muse. Her political expression intensified. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in demonstrations, wrote fiery letters, and called out imperialism and injustice. When her health no longer allowed her to walk, she appeared at protests in a wheelchair, boldly raising placards and shouting slogans. In 1953, Frida was given her debut solo show in Mexico, a long overdue celebration of her art. But her health was so fragile, Doctors told her she couldn't attend. So she did what only Frida would do. She arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the gallery on her hospital bed. Dressed in traditional finery, surrounded by her own work, she greeted guests with tequila, laughter, and that fire still burning in her eyes. Her final paintings were both innocent and distressing. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she painted herself wearing a steel corset, cradled by the hands of Marx, casting away symbols of oppression. Her last known work was a still life of sliced watermelons, one piece bearing the words Viva la vida, long live life. Even in the face of death, she remained defiant, joyful, and political. Frida Kahlo's last portraits weren't just self-portraits. They were acts of revolution, painted in pain, but always signed with life. On July 13, 1954, at the age of 47, Frida Kahlo died in the same place she had been born, the Blue House in Coyoacán. The official cause was listed as a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her whispered of something deeper. She had been ill, yes, but also exhausted by pain, by surgeries, by the long war with her own body. Just days before, she had attended a political protest against the CIA coup in Guatemala. Weak and wheelchair-bound, she insisted on going, her clenched fist raised in the air. Revolution remained her final heartbeat. Her last diary entry was brief but piercing. I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return. Frida's funeral was held at the Palace of Fine Arts, Mexico's most prestigious cultural institution. Her body, draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was inconsolable. He called her the greatest love of his life, even though his betrayals had nearly broken her. But in the years that followed her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name was whispered only in art circles. Her works weren't easy to categorize. Too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But slowly, her image, her story, and her defiance began to resonate. Through the 1970s and 1980s, as feminist scholars and activists reclaimed forgotten voices, Frida's became louder. She wasn't just a painter anymore. She was a symbol of pain transformed into beauty, of feminism born through resistance, of Mexican identity celebrated without apology, of queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity. Her face, her mono-browed gaze, flowers in her hair, became iconic. Her home became a museum. Her diary became a sacred text, and her paintings now hang in the world's greatest museums. Frida Kahlo had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow. But in death, she stepped forward. She didn't just leave behind paintings. She left behind a mirror and dared us all to look, not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's face is everywhere, printed on T-shirts, painted on murals, transformed into dolls, memes, posters, and icons. Her signature monobrow, her flower-crowned hair, her direct gaze, all instantly recognizable. But what makes her legacy powerful isn't just that people know her face, it's that they recognize the truth behind it. Frida didn't try to be flawless. She didn't fit into boxes. She wasn't conventional, and she didn't care to be. In a world that demands perfection, she gave us realness. Raw, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful, contradictory realness. She celebrated what made her different: her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and turned it into art that transcended borders and decades. She's become more than an artist. She's a global symbol of defiance, feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. For queer communities, she's a fearless bisexual icon who lived openly and unapologetically in a time that demanded silence. For women, she's a reminder that power doesn't require permission. For disabled artists, she's proof that pain can fuel the brush, not stop it. And for Mexico, she's a daughter reclaimed, spirited, folkloric, and forever part of the national soul. Her paintings, once dismissed as too strange or too personal, are now among the most revered in the world. Works like the two Fridas, self-portrait with thorn necklace and hummingbird, and the broken column aren't just seen. They're felt deeply by anyone who has ever suffered and needed to turn that suffering into something sacred. She resided at the fringes and made them the focal point. She embraced contradiction, a communist who wore gold, a woman betrayed who loved again, a body in pieces with a soul unbreakable. And through it all, she painted not just with color, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never asked to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself, and in doing so, told the truth for millions of others who had never seen themselves reflected in art before. Now, when we see her face, we see courage. We see color. We see resistance. We see Frida, not gone but immortal,